They told her, "Don't bother dressing up." But when she walked in, even the music stopped. Not one person could look away. Welcome back, and enjoy what might be the best story you'll watch today. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune of broken dreams as Amanda Grace stared at the crumpled bank statement in her trembling hands. $12.37. The numbers blurred through tears she refused to let fall. Not here, not in the cramped break room of Hartwell Associates, where the coffee maker dripped its endless rhythm of corporate indifference. The ancient machine wheezed and gurgled like an old man's last breath, filling the silence with the sound of mediocrity that had become the soundtrack to her life. Her worn black flats, resoled twice at Tony's corner cobbler shop on State Street, pressed against the cracked linoleum floor that had seen better decades. The yellowed tiles told stories of countless lunch breaks, spilled coffee, and whispered conversations about who was getting promoted and who was getting passed over. Amanda had been passed over so many times she'd stopped counting, stopped hoping, stopped believing that her economics degree from Northwestern meant anything in a world where connections mattered more than credentials. The invitation lay beside her, untouched sandwich white bread, with a thin spread of generic peanut butter, her lunch for the third day running. The elegant cardstock mocked her with its embossed lettering in gold edges, announcing the firm's annual gala at the Crystal Harbor Hotel. She'd received one every year for 3 years, a formality that reminded her of her place in the hierarchy, somewhere between the janitor and the potted plants that lined the corridors. Amanda's fingers traced the outline of the invitation, remembering the first time she'd received one. She'd been so excited, so naive, actually believing it was a gesture of inclusion. She'd spent her entire paycheck on a department store dress and cheap heels that left blisters on her feet, only to stand alone by the appetizer table while partners and associates networked around her as if she were invisible. That night, she'd gone home and cried until her eyes were swollen, then promised herself she'd never be that foolish again. But this year felt different. This year, the cruelty felt more pointed, more deliberate, as if someone had decided that simply ignoring her wasn't enough anymore. The break room door stood slightly ajar, and through it, she could hear the familiar sound of expensive heels clicking against polished marblia, sound that always preceded humiliation. "Amanda, are you coming to the company gala?" The voice belonged to Lauren Mitchell, senior partner's daughter, whose trust fund had paved her way through Harvard Law and directly into a corner office she'd never earned. Lauren's perfectly manicured fingers, painted in a shade of red that cost more than Amanda's monthly groceries, drummed against the doorframe like a predator marking territory. Her smile was sharp as broken glass, polished to perfection, but cutting to the touch. Lauren's blonde hair was pulled back in a chignon that probably cost $200 at the salon on Michigan Avenue, where Amanda had once cleaned toilets during her college summers. Her suit was Armani, her shoes Louboutin, her confidence the kind that money could buy and poverty could never touch. Behind her stood 3 other associates: Jennifer Walsh, whose father owned half of downtown Chicago; Marcus Sterling, whose family name was on buildings throughout the city; and David Park, whose mother sat on the board of trustees at the RT Institute. They formed a semicircle around the doorway like vultures circling wounded prey, their faces masks of false concern and barely concealed amusement. Amanda recognized the look she'd seen it countless times in the 3 years since she'd started at the firm. The expression of people who had never known want, never felt the gnawing emptiness of choosing between food and heat, never had to smile while their dreams were dissected for entertainment. "You know it's black tie, right?" Lauren continued, her voice dripping with honey-coated poison. She paused for effect, savoring the moment like expensive wine, letting the words settle in the stale air of the break room. "But don't bother dressing up. It's not like anyone's expecting you to stand out." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, poisonous and impossible to escape. Around Lauren, the other associates snickered, not loudly, just enough to let Amanda know her place in their carefully constructed hierarchy. Jennifer covered her mouth with her hand, her diamond bracelet catching the harsh fluorescent light. Marcus adjusted his tie, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both superiority and dismissal. David simply shook his head, as if Amanda's very existence was a disappointment he had to endure. Amanda's fingers tightened around the bank statement, the paper crinkling like autumn leaves under her grip. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence that followed Lauren's pronouncement. She didn't respond. She never did. 3 years at Hartwell Associates. 3 years of making perfect coffee and filing documents with meticulous care. 3 years of staying late to finish projects that others took credit for. And not once had she been treated as anything more than a convenient shadow, there when needed and invisible when not. But something stirred in the depths of her chest that afternoon, something that had been dormant since her mother's funeral 5 years ago. It was a feeling she'd almost forgotten, buried under layers of disappointment and daily survival, the ember of defiance that poverty couldn't quite extinguish, the spark of dignity that humiliation couldn't quite snuff out. Amanda had once believed she could belong somewhere, could matter to someone beyond her utility. Those beliefs felt like artifacts from another life now, relics of a girl who had graduated summa cum laude and believed that merit would triumph over money, that hard work would overcome hereditary privilege. That girl had died slowly, one rejection at a time, one condescending comment after another, until all that remained was this hollow shell going through the motions of existence. Her mother used to brush her long auburn hair with gentle strokes, the bristles of the old silver brush making soft sounds against her scalp, while evening light filtered through the thin curtains of their small apartment. Those moments had been sacred, a daily ritual of love and hope in a world that offered little of either. "You are the most beautiful girl in this world, Amanda," her mother would whisper, her voice soft but certain. "Don't let it scare you when others don't see it. Beauty isn't just what's on the surface, it's the light that shines from within, and yours burns brighter than any star." Her father, a man whose calloused hands had built dreams from nothing and lost them to economic forces beyond his control, used to tell her that kindness and intelligence would open doors that money couldn't buy. He'd worked construction during the day and studied accounting at night, believing that education was the ladder out of poverty, that his daughter would climb higher than he ever could. His faith in her had been absolute, unshakable, even when the bills piled up and the creditors called, and their modest dreams crumbled like castles made of sand. Those were the days before inflation stole their modest house on Maple Street, a small bungalow with a front porch where her mother grew tomatoes and coffee cans, and her father read the newspaper every evening after work. Those were the days before food stamps replaced Sunday family dinners, before her father's back gave out, and the medical bills consumed what little savings they'd managed to accumulate, before her parents died, her father from a heart worn thin by endless worry, and her mother from grief that ate her alive like cancer, consuming her from the inside until there was nothing left but shadows and regret. Amanda remembered standing at their graves in Graceland Cemetery, rain soaking through her only black dress, while the preacher spoke words that meant nothing to anyone who wasn't listening. She'd been 23, alone in the world with student loans and a degree that felt worthless in her hands, promising her parents' headstones that she would survive, she would rise, she would make them proud. 5 years later, that promise felt like another lie she'd told herself to get through another day. At 28, Amanda lived alone in a studio apartment on the South Side, where the radiator coughed like an old man with pneumonia, and the neighbors shouted through walls thin as tissue paper. The building was a relic from the 1940s, its brick facade stained with decades of Chicago weather, and its hallways smelling of cabbage and broken dreams. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, reached by climbing stairs that creaked ominously under even her slight weight, past doors that bore the scars of multiple break-ins, and the resignation of people who had stopped believing in better days. She washed her hair in cold water when the hot water heater failed, which was often, standing in the tiny bathroom with its cracked mirror and rust-stained fixtures, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity in a world determined to strip it away. She skipped meals to keep the electricity on, rationing her food like a refugee in her own country, and darned her stockings by the light of a lamp she'd bought at a garage sale for $3. Her shoes were second-hand treasures from the Salvation Army, carefully chosen for their potential, rather than their condition, pinching her toes, but never quite breaking her spirit until now. She'd learned to walk in heels by practicing in her apartment, holding onto the kitchen counter for balance, while she dreamed of occasions important enough to warrant the discomfort. Those occasions had never come, but she'd kept practicing anyway, holding on to hope the way drowning people clutch life preservers. That evening, sitting cross-legged on her narrow bed with her knees pulled to her chest, she finally broke. The invitation mocked her from the nightstand, its elegant script promising an evening of champagne and networking, while her stomach growled its empty song. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in around her, pressing down with the weight of all her accumulated failures, all the dreams she'd abandoned, all the promises she'd broken to herself and her parents' memory. "They want to laugh at me?" she whispered to the silence, her voice cracking like ice on a frozen pond. The words seemed to echo in the small space, bouncing off the bare walls, and coming back to her amplified, magnified, impossible to ignore. "They want to see me small, to watch me disappear into nothing." She opened her closet, a narrow space that held more hope than clothing, more memories than material possessions. The few pieces hanging there told the story of a life lived on the margins, carefully curated necessities rather than choices. But among the handful of work blouses and worn skirts hung a single dress that seemed to glow in the dim light, like a beacon in the darkness of her diminished expectations. Crimson satin, cut in the elegant lines of the 1960s, it had been her mother's favorite dress, the one she wore to her college graduation, when she became the first person in her family to earn a degree. Her wedding to Amanda's father in a small ceremony at City Hall, every special occasion that mattered in a life that had been rich in love, if not in money. The dress had been carefully preserved, wrapped in tissue paper, and stored in a box that smelled of lavender and cedar, of dreams that had been deferred, but never quite died. Amanda lifted the dress with reverent hands, feeling the weight of its history, the memories woven into every thread. She held it against herself in the cracked mirror that leaned against the wall, a mirror she'd found abandoned on the street and carefully cleaned until it reflected truth, if not perfection. The color brought life to her pale cheeks, made her green eyes shine like emeralds in candlelight, transformed her from a shadow into something that demanded attention. She had worn it only once, to her college graduation, when her parents had been so proud they couldn't stop crying, when the future had seemed bright with possibility and dreams, had felt like plans rather than fantasies. Now, staring at her reflection in the uncertain light of her apartment, she made a decision that would change everything, a choice that would either destroy her completely or reveal the person she'd always been beneath the layers of defeat and disappointment. The Crystal Harbor Hotel rose from Chicago's lakefront like a monument to ambition, its Art Deco facade gleaming under the October moon like a jewel against the dark waters of Lake Michigan. The building had been a symbol of the city's resurgence since the 1920s, its soaring lines and geometric patterns, speaking of dreams, made manifest in steel and stone. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp promise of autumn, and the city's elite gathered in their finest attire, stepping from limousines and luxury sedans like actors taking the stage for a performance they'd rehearsed their entire lives. Amanda arrived on foot. She couldn't afford a taxi, much less the valet parking that gleamed with luxury cars, worth more than she'd earned in 5 years. Her journey from the L station had taken her through the heart of downtown Chicago, past the glittering storefronts of Michigan Avenue and the towering monuments to capitalism that defined the city's skyline. Each step had been a test of her resolve, each reflection in the shop windows a reminder of the choice she'd made. She paused at the marble steps of the hotel, her reflection multiplied in the polished surfaces around her. The doorman, resplendent in his gold-braided uniform that probably cost more than she spent on clothing in a year, glanced at her with barely concealed surprise. She didn't look like the other guests streaming past in their designer gowns and borrowed jewels, their faces masks of practiced sophistication and inherited confidence. But she looked like something else entirely, like quiet thunder before a storm, like the moment before lightning strikes, like the pause between heartbeats when everything hangs in the balance. The crimson dress moved with her like liquid fire, its simple elegance making every other gown in sight seem overdressed and desperate, trying too hard to achieve what she possessed naturally. Amanda pushed open the golden doors and stepped into a world that had always existed just beyond her reach, a realm of marble and crystal that spoke of power and privilege in languages she'd never been taught to speak. The ballroom stretched before her like a scene from a movie, all cream marble and soft lighting, filled with the low murmur of important conversations and the gentle clink of crystal, the soundtrack of a life she'd only glimpsed from the outside. And then, as if someone had pressed pause on the evening itself, The room went silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Champagne flutes froze halfway to lips, and heads turned in a synchronized movement that would have been choreographed if it hadn't been so spontaneous. The silence spread like ripples on a pond, encompassing the entire ballroom, until even the string quartet in the corner seemed to falter in their performance. She didn't just walk in, she arrived. And in that moment of absolute quiet, Amanda Grace finally understood what her mother had meant all those years ago. Finally felt the truth of the words that had seemed like wishful thinking. Finally saw herself reflected in the stunned faces around her, not as the invisible assistant, but as the woman she'd always been, waiting for the world to notice what had been there all along. But the real revelation was yet to come, building in the silence like pressure in a storm cloud, about to transform not just her evening, but her entire understanding of who she was and where she belonged in a world that had never seemed to have room for her dreams. Lauren Mitchell stood frozen, her champagne flute suspended in midair like a crystal exclamation point, marking the moment her world tilted off its axis. The black Valentino gown that had made her feel invincible just moments before now seemed like costume jewelry next to Amanda's quiet radiance. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock that drained color from her cheeks, couldn't mask the disbelief that widened her blue eyes until they resembled those of a startled deer caught in headlights. "That can't be her," someone whispered behind a gloved hand, the words carrying across the suddenly hushed ballroom like ripples on still water. The voice belonged to Margaret Worthington, wife of the city's most prominent real estate developer, a woman whose opinions could make or break social careers with a single raised eyebrow. But even Margaret's legendary composure seemed shaken as she stared at the vision in crimson who had somehow materialized in their exclusive sanctuary. Jared Newsome, the junior partner who had never bothered to learn Amanda's last name despite working with her for 3 years, stepped back instinctively as she passed, his confident smirk dissolving like sugar in rain. His hand moved unconsciously to straighten his bow tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed the unease suddenly coursing through his privileged veins. For the first time in his charmed life, Jared felt the uncomfortable sensation of being outclassed by someone he'd dismissed as irrelevant. The crowd seemed to part before Amanda, like the Red Sea, not from reverence, but from a kind of stunned paralysis that comes when the natural order of things suddenly reveals itself to be built on foundations of sand. She moved through the space with unconscious grace, her chin held high not from arrogance, but from a dignity that poverty had never been able to steal, that humiliation had never quite managed to break. She had learned to walk like this from her mother, who had taught her that true elegance came from within, from knowing your worth even when the world insisted you had none. "Stand tall, baby girl," her mother used to say while they practiced walking with books balanced on their heads in their tiny living room. Queens aren't born wearing crowns, they learn to carry themselves like royalty until the world has no choice but to notice. Amanda's auburn hair, curled loosely, and pinned with her mother's pearl hairpin, the only piece of jewelry that had survived the estate sale after her parents' deaths, got the light from the crystal chandeliers above. The pearls were cultured, not real, but they gleamed with the patina of love and memory, more precious than any diamond because they carried the weight of dreams passed down through generations of women who had believed in better days. The ballroom itself seemed to hold its breath, its cream-colored walls adorned with paintings worth more than most people's homes, its soaring ceiling decorated with frescoes that told stories of Chicago's golden age. The Crystal Harbor Hotel had hosted presidents and princes, had witnessed deals that shaped the nation's economy and romances that dominated society pages. But in all its storied history, it had rarely seen a transformation as complete as the one unfolding before its distinguished guests. Marcus Sterling, heir to a steel fortune that had built half of Chicago's skyline, found himself unconsciously smoothing his hair as Amanda passed his table. He'd attended the same preparatory school as kings and presidents, had been groomed from birth to move in circles where confidence was currency and breeding was everything. Yet, something about this woman's presence made him feel like a schoolboy again, uncertain and awkward in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Jennifer Walsh, whose family's pharmaceutical empire had funded half the city's hospitals, gripped her Hermes clutch so tightly her knuckles went white. She'd spent 2 hours getting ready, had her hair styled by the same team that prepared actresses for red carpet events, had chosen her sapphire, necklace, specifically because it matched her eyes and cost more than most people's cars. But staring at Amanda, she felt overdressed and overcompensated, like someone playing dress-up in her mother's jewelry box. The string quartet, composed of musicians from the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, found their rhythm faltering as they too became caught up in the spell of the moment. The violinist, a woman who had performed for audiences of thousands without missing a note, nearly dropped her bow as Amanda's gaze swept past her. There was something in those green eyes that spoke of depths unexplored, of stories untold, of a strength that had been forged in fires these privileged guests had never imagined. But the real twist was yet to come, building in the silence like pressure in a storm cloud about to burst. Amanda continued her journey across the ballroom floor, her reflection multiplied in the mirrors that lined the walls, each image capturing a different angle of the same impossible truth, that the woman they dismissed as invisible had been hiding in plain sight all along, not as their inferior, but as something far more dangerous to their carefully constructed worldview, their equal. Amanda Grace? The voice cut through the whispers, like a lighthouse beam through fog, strong and clear, and filled with an emotion that transformed the entire atmosphere of the room. An older man with silver hair and a distinguished British accent was making his way across the ballroom, his face lit with recognition and something that looked remarkably like joy. The crowd parted before him with even greater deference than they'd shown Amanda, their recognition of his importance automatic and absolute. Thomas Ellington, billionaire investor and tonight's guest of honor, moved with the confidence of a man who had reshaped industries and toppled governments with nothing more than strategic thinking and impeccable timing. His net worth was rumored to exceed that of small nations. His influence reached into boardrooms and political chambers across 3 continents, and his opinion could make or break careers with a single word. He was the kind of man who made presidents nervous and caused stock markets to fluctuate with his moods. But right now, he looked like nothing more than a grandfather who had just spotted his favorite grandchild across a crowded room. His weathered face, lined with decades of difficult decisions and calculated risks, was transformed by genuine warmth as he approached Amanda with arms outstretched in greeting. The transformation was so complete, so unexpected, that several guests wondered if they were witnessing the early stages of dementia in the great man's mind. "Sir, Mr. Ellington?" Amanda's voice was barely a whisper, disbelief coloring every syllable like watercolors bleeding into paper. She recognized him. Of course, his face had graced the covers of Time magazine and Forbes. His biography was required reading in business schools. His investment firm managed portfolios that could fund small nations. But seeing him here now, calling her name with such familiarity, felt like stepping into someone else's dream. The room held its collective breath, watching this impossible scene unfold before their astonished eyes. Lauren Mitchell felt her world tilting further off its axis, her champagne finally spilling over the rim of her glass to stain her designer gown. Marcus Sterling's mouth fell open in a way that would have embarrassed him if he'd been aware of it. Jennifer Walsh actually gasped audibly, a sound that carried across the silent ballroom like a gunshot. What happened next would be talked about in Chicago society circles for years to come. A story that would grow in the telling until it became legend. The night when everything everyone thought they knew about Amanda Grace and about themselves was turned completely upside down. The moment when the natural order revealed itself to be nothing more than a comfortable illusion, and truth stepped forward, wearing a crimson dress and her mother's pearl hairpin. Thomas Ellington reached Amanda, and without hesitation, took both of her hands in his eyes bright with tears that he made no attempt to hide. "My dear girl," he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "I almost didn't recognize you. It's been, 2 years? 3? You look absolutely radiant." His words carried the weight of genuine affection, the kind of warmth that couldn't be faked or bought. The recognition of one soul by another across the artificial barriers that society erected to keep people in their designated places. The silence that followed his words was absolute, profound, the kind of quiet that comes just before earthquakes reshape the landscape. Every person in that ballroom was reassessing everything they thought they knew, every assumption they'd made, every judgment they'd passed. The woman they dismissed as insignificant was standing in conversation with one of the most powerful men in the world, and he was treating her not as a curiosity or a charity case, but as someone who mattered, someone whose presence brought him joy. Amanda felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, felt the shift in the room's energy like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. But for the first time in years, the attention didn't make her want to disappear. Instead, standing there with Thomas Ellington's hands warm around hers, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: the sensation of being seen, truly seen, for who she was rather than what she lacked. Have you ever experienced or known someone who has experienced a moment when their true worth was suddenly recognized after being overlooked for so long? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thomas, Amanda said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that surprised even herself. What are you doing here? The question hung in the air like incense, sacred and transformative, while the assembled crowd leaned forward imperceptibly, straining to catch every word of this impossible conversation. She remembered him now, not as the titan of industry these people knew, but as the gentle man who had sat in the back of her English classroom in a small village outside Accra, Ghana, taking notes with the earnestness of a first-year student. Thomas Ellington's face lit up like sunrise over Lake Michigan, his weathered features transformed by memories that seemed to make him younger with each passing second. I'm the keynote speaker tonight, my dear, though I confess I'd much rather be sitting in your classroom again, listening to you explain the intricacies of Shakespearean verse to those children. His voice carried across the ballroom with the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention, but it was softened by an affection that made several society matrons clutch their pearls in confusion. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. Margaret Worthington's fan fluttered so rapidly it seemed she might achieve flight, while her husband Harold nearly choked on his imported caviar. The idea that Thomas Ellington, a man who could buy and sell most of them without checking his bank balance, was speaking to Amanda Grace as if she were an old friend challenged every assumption they'd built their social hierarchy upon. You know her? Lauren Mitchell's voice cracked like thin ice, her question emerging as barely more than a whisper. The confidence that had carried her through Harvard Law School and into her corner office seemed to evaporate like morning mist, leaving behind only the uncertain girl who had always feared that her father's money couldn't buy her the one thing she'd always wanted: genuine respect. Thomas turned to the crowd with the same commanding presence that had made him billions, his silver hair catching the light from the chandeliers like a crown. He repeated, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made stock markets fluctuate. This remarkable woman spent 2 years teaching English in my granddaughter's village in Ghana. She rebuilt their school with nothing but determination and borrowed supplies, taught children who had never owned a book to read and write and dream. The revelation hit the ballroom like a physical force, causing champagne glasses to tremble in manicured hands and forcing several guests to grip the backs of chairs for support. Amanda Grace, the invisible assistant who made coffee and filed paper shad, lived a life they'd never bothered to discover, had made a difference in ways they'd never imagined possible. She taught my granddaughter Sarah to read, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with emotion. Sarah was 8 years old and had been told she wasn't clever enough for books. Amanda spent every evening for 6 months, sitting with her, using picture books and patience, until the day Sarah read her first complete sentence aloud. His eyes glistened with unshed tears as he looked at Amanda. Do you remember what she said? Amanda smiled, and for the first time all evening, it reached her eyes. The girl can fly with her dreams, she quoted softly. It was from a book about a little girl who wanted to be a pilot. Sarah made me read it 17 times that first week. The memory wrapped around her like a warm embrace, transporting her back to those dusty evenings in Ghana, where she'd discovered that her true calling wasn't in corporate boardrooms, but in moments of connection that transcended language and culture. She can fly with her dreams, Thomas repeated, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. And because of Amanda, she is. Sarah graduated from university last month with honors in engineering. She's designing solar panels for rural communities now, All because one teacher believed in her when no one else would. The silence that followed was different from before, not the shocked quiet of social upheaval, but the reverent hush that comes when people realize they're witnessing something sacred. Jennifer Walsh found tears streaming down her carefully made-up cheeks, her sapphire necklace suddenly feeling heavy as chains around her throat. Marcus Sterling, who had never known what it meant to struggle for anything, felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of worth that had nothing to do with bank accounts or bloodlines. Jared Newsom stood frozen, his whiskey glass forgotten in his hand, as he processed the magnitude of his misunderstanding. For 3 years, he'd worked alongside a woman who had literally changed lives, who had built something meaningful from nothing, who possessed a wealth of experience and compassion that his Ivy League education had never taught him to recognize or value. The village wanted to name the school after her, Thomas continued, turning back to Amanda with eyes bright with pride. The Amanda Gray School for Girls. She refused, of course, said the school belonged to the children, not to her. But they named the library after her anyway, painted it in bright colors that could be seen from miles away. Where dreams take flight, they wrote above the door. Amanda felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, but for the first time in years, she didn't want to disappear. The shame that had followed her like a shadow since her return to Chicago began to lift, replaced by something she'd forgotten she possessed. Pride in who she was and what she'd accomplished, regardless of what others thought or how little money she had in her bank account. "Why did you come back?" Lauren asked, her voice small and uncertain. The question escaped before she could stop it, emerging from a genuine curiosity that surprised her. For the first time in her privileged life, she was looking at someone who had walked away from recognition and admiration, who had chosen struggle over comfort, and she couldn't understand the motivation behind such a choice. Amanda's gaze swept across the ballroom, taking in the faces of people who had ignored her, dismissed her, made her feel invisible for 3 long years. But instead of anger, she felt something approaching compassion. They were trapped in their golden cages just as surely as she'd been trapped in her poverty, prisoners of expectations and appearances that prevented them from seeing beyond the surface of things. "My visa expired," she said simply, "and my parents had died while I was away. I came back to settle their affairs and found myself with nothing, no savings, no job prospects, mountains of medical debt. I took the first position I could find that would pay enough to keep me fed and housed while I figured out what came next." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "I never imagined that what came next would take 3 years to arrive." Thomas Ellington stepped closer to Amanda, his presence both protective and proud. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had addressed parliaments and board meetings. "I'd like you to meet one of the most remarkable women I've ever had the privilege to know. Someone who gave up a comfortable life to serve others, who built hope where none existed, who proved that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the difference we make." The transformation in the room was palpable, like watching flowers bloom in fast-forward photography. Conversations that had stopped when Amanda entered began to resume, but now they centered around her, instead of excluding her. People who had looked through her for 3 years suddenly found themselves desperate to be introduced, to hear her stories, to bask in the reflected glory of her association with Thomas Ellington. But the most profound change was in Amanda herself. Standing there in her mother's crimson dress, surrounded by people who finally saw her worth, she felt the last vestiges of shame and self-doubt falling away like autumn leaves. She was still the same person who lived in a studio apartment and counted pennies, but she was also the woman who had changed lives in Ghana, who had built something beautiful from nothing, who carried within herself a strength that no amount of money could buy or poverty could steal. The evening that had begun as an exercise in humiliation had become something else entirely, a revelation, a reckoning, a moment when the true nature of value was revealed to a room full of people who had confused price with worth for far too long. And at the center of it all stood Amanda Grace, no longer invisible, no longer ashamed, finally ready to claim her place in a world that was only now beginning to understand what it had overlooked. What would happen next would determine not just the course of her evening, but the trajectory of her entire life, as doors that had been closed for years suddenly swung open, revealing possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. The weeks that followed the gala passed like pages in a book Amanda had never dared to read. Each day, bringing revelations that rewrote the story of her life in ways she'd never imagined possible. The video of her entrance had indeed gone viral, just as Thomas had predicted, spreading across social media platforms with the velocity of wildfire. They told her not to dress up then. The world saw who she really was, became more than just a headline. It became a movement, a rallying cry for everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off as insignificant. But the real transformation wasn't happening online, it was happening in the quiet moments of Amanda's daily existence, in the way she carried herself as she walked down Michigan Avenue, in the confidence that had replaced the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes that had defined her for so long. The crimson dress hung in her closet like a talisman, a reminder that she was the same woman who had worn it that night, who had faced down a room full of people who had dismissed her, and emerged victorious not through vengeance, but through the simple act of being authentically herself. Thomas Ellington had wasted no time in putting his influence to work on Amanda's behalf. Within 48 hours of the gala, her phony, a battered device she'd been nursing along for 3 years, was ringing with opportunities that would have seemed like fantasies just days before. The Chicago Tribune wanted an interview about her work in Ghana. Northwestern University's School of Education was interested in having her develop a curriculum for international service learning. 3 different nonprofit organizations had called, offering positions that would allow her to use her experience in meaningful ways. But the call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while Amanda was sitting in her tiny apartment, watching frost form patterns on her single window. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, director of the Global Literacy Initiative, a foundation funded by some of the world's wealthiest philanthropists. They wanted Amanda to head their new program developing schools in underserved communities across Africa and South America. The salary they offered was more than triple what she'd been making at Hartwell Associates, with benefits that included housing allowances, education funds, and the kind of financial security she'd stopped believing was possible. "We've been looking for someone with your exact combination of experience and passion for 2 years, Doctor," Morrison explained, her voice warm with enthusiasm. "Thomas Ellington's recommendation carries enormous weight, but it was your work in Ghana that truly impressed our board. We need someone who understands that real change happens one child, one classroom, one community at a time." Amanda accepted the position with tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally finding her place in the world. That afternoon, she walked into Hartwell Associates for what she knew would be the last time, carrying a letter of resignation that she'd written with the same care she'd once used to craft lesson plans for her students in Ghana. The office felt different as she moved through its familiar corridors, smaller somehow, as if her expanded sense of self had changed the very dimensions of the space. Conversations stopped as she passed, not with the cruel anticipation of mockery, but with something approaching respect. The video had reached here too, and suddenly everyone knew that the woman they'd ignored possessed a depth and significance they'd never bothered to discover. Lauren Mitchell was waiting in the break room, the same space where she delivered her cutting remarks about not bothering to dress up. But the confident cruelty that had defined her interactions with Amanda was nowhere to be found. Instead, she looked smaller, uncertain, like someone who had just realized that the foundation of her worldview was built on quicksand. "Amanda," Lauren began, her voice lacking its usual edge, I need to apologize for what I said about the gala, for how I've treated you. I had no idea about your background, about what you'd accomplished." She paused, struggling with words that felt foreign in her mouth. "I was wrong. About everything." Amanda studied Lauren's face, seeing for the first time not the privileged antagonist who had made her life miserable, but a young woman trapped by expectations she'd never chosen, performing a role that had been written for her before she was old enough to understand its limitations. The anger she'd carried for so long seemed suddenly pointless, a weight she no longer needed to bear. "Thank you for saying that," Amanda replied simply. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Lauren. I hope you find a way to be happy that doesn't require making others feel small." The resignation meeting with the senior partners was brief and professional, their attempts to convince her to stay half-hearted at best. They knew they'd lost something valuable, but they also understood that their failure to recognize that value had made her departure inevitable. As Amanda cleaned out her desk, a process that took less than 10 minutes and she'd never been allowed to accumulate anything of significance, she felt not bitterness, but a strange kind of gratitude. This place had been her wilderness, the desert she'd had to cross to reach her promised land. 2 months later, Amanda stood in the doorway of her new apartment in Lincoln Park, a spacious one-bedroom with hardwood floors and windows that faced east toward Lake Michigan. The morning light streamed across polished surfaces that reflected not just images but possibilities, illuminating a life that felt finally, fully hers. The crimson dress hung in a real closet now, surrounded by clothes that fit properly and shoes that didn't pinch her feet, but it remained her most treasured possession, not because of its material value, but because of what it represented. The moment she'd chosen to stop hiding and started shining, her new position had exceeded every expectation she'd dared to harbor. In just 8 weeks, she'd helped establish 3 new schools, trained 47 teachers, and watched hundreds of children discover the magic of reading for the first time. The work was challenging, requiring travel to remote locations and long hours spent building relationships across cultural and linguistic barriers. But it fed her soul in ways that shuffling papers and making coffee never could. The phone rang as she was preparing breakfast, real breakfast, with fresh fruit and coffee that didn't come from a machine older than democracy. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice that greeted her was familiar and warm. "Miss Amanda? Is that you?" The accent was unmistakably Ghanaian, musical and bright with excitement. "Sarah?" Amanda's heart leaped as she recognized the voice of her former student, the little girl who had struggled to read her first sentence and was now an engineer designing sustainable technology for rural communities. "I saw the video, Miss Amanda. Everyone in the village saw it. We were so proud watching you walk into that room like a queen. We always knew you were special, but now the whole world knows too." Sarah's laughter bubbled through the phone line like clear water, carrying with it the warmth of a connection that transcended distance and time. They talked for an hour, catching up on the changes in both their lives, sharing dreams and plans for the future. Sarah was engaged now to a young man who shared her passion for bringing technology to underserved communities. She was planning to return to the village where Amanda had taught her to read, to establish a technical college that would train the next generation of engineers and innovators. "I want to name it after you," Sarah said, her voice serious now. "The Amanda Grace Institute for Innovation. Because you taught me that dreams aren't just for sleeping, they're for making real." Amanda felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, of fulfillment, of a happiness so complete it felt almost overwhelming. "Name it after yourself, Sarah. You're the one who made those dreams reality. I just helped you remember that you could fly." After they hung up, Amanda sat in the window seat of her new apartment, watching the city wake up below her. Chicago stretched out in all directions, a tapestry of dreams and struggles, of people searching for their place in the world, just as she had searched for hers. Somewhere out there, in offices and schools and tiny apartments, other people were facing the same choice she'd faced that night at the gala, the choice between staying small and safe or stepping into the light and claiming their worth. Her laptop chimed with an email from Dr. Morrison, containing details about their next project, a literacy program for refugee children in camps across 3 continents. The scope was ambitious, the challenges enormous, but Amanda felt nothing but excitement as she read through the plans. She thought about her parents, about the promises she'd made at their gravesites, about the dreams they'd nurtured in a little girl who believed she could change the world. They would be proud, she realized, not just of her success, but of the woman she'd become, someone who used her pain to fuel her compassion, who transformed her struggles into strength that could lift others. The afternoon sun slanted through her windows, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. Amanda Grace, no longer invisible, no longer ashamed, no longer afraid, opened her laptop and began planning her next adventure, her next opportunity to prove that one person really could make a difference. One child at a time, one dream at a time, one dream at a time, moment of believing in something better at a time. The woman who had once counted pennies and skipped meals now had the resources to feed her body. But more importantly, she had found the work that fed her soul. The journey from that cramped break room to this sunlit apartment had been measured, not just in distance but in the courage to remember who she really was, to step out of the shadows and into the light, to trust that the world was ready to see what had been there all along. And as the city hummed with life below her windows, Amanda smiled, knowing that somewhere out there, another person was preparing to make their own choice, to walk through their own golden doors, to discover their own worth in a world that sometimes forgets to look for the treasures hidden in plain sight. The story that had begun with tears in a break room had become a testament to the power of recognition, the magic of being truly seen, and the truth that sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones we never notice until they decide to shine. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.